Hi there, it's John here from itsmorethanjustgaming.com and welcome today. Today I'm going to be looking at a role-playing game I've recently been given or loaned a copy of the rules for, and after reading a couple of chapters of it I was so excited and couldn't sleep that I actually ordered it the very next day. It's called Microscope. I'll just hold that up to the camera for you just there. It says on the front, a fractal role-playing game of epic histories by Ben Robbins. And as you can see, I'm using a railway ticket as a bookmark because I've lost all my bookmarks, because I'm a little bit untidy when it comes to small things like bookmarks, even though they're quite important. Now, as it says here, it's a fractal role-playing game of making epic histories. And that probably is as baffling to you as it might have been to me. Now, I've seen various science fiction programs and I've actually tried looking up the definition of fractal and it's still mystifying. So I'll give you an idea of what this game is about. I'll also tell you what this game I think is a worthy addition to any roleplay gamer, their library, or indeed any creative writer of fiction's library, and that's actually one of the reasons I'm doing this video. I think this is a fantastic game, see, there it is again, for creators of fiction, because some of the techniques used in playing this game are very useful if you're plotting timelines. This game is not about creating a character. It doesn't actually have a GM, and there's no preparation really required. I mean, there's a tiny bit of preparation, and I'll get onto that shortly, or later on in the video, I should say. The idea is that a group of players will decide on what sort of story they're wanting to tell, whether they're wanting to do an epic fantasy or an epic science fiction or even an epic supernatural story. Epic anything that lasts a significant period of time. They create a top-end statement and they define a number of parameters, and then they take it in turns to add things to the historical timeline. And as the game progresses, it goes round in turns. They will add new eras to their timeline. They will then zoom in, well, they're called periods in this, I'll go through some of the terminology shortly, and they can zoom in on their periods and put specific events in the periods, and then they can zoom into an event and do scenes. Periods and events and scenes I'm going to cover just shortly. What you can achieve with this is actually mind-boggling. You can, realistically, in maybe 3 or 4 hours, you can actually put together a fairly surprising historical timeline for a new world you've just created. And you could come back to this as many times as you want because it's infinitely updatable. You can always add more things, even if you think you've got to the end of the timeline, because you don't do it in chronological order when you're playing the game. You can just focus in on any part of the history of the story you're trying to tell, and that is what you're looking at just now. And then you can go backwards along the timeline and say, actually, you know what? That part of the story I was looking at, we were looking at a villain. Actually, let's look at the rise of the villain. We've looked at the fall of the villain. Let's actually see what caused them to become a villain in the first place. Let's tell that story. Okay, we've looked at the hero. They've deposed this villain in this time period. What happens afterwards? Are they still heroic? Do they actually go on and be the hero of the era, or do they become a villain in their own right? Or if it's a fantasy epic, do they become another despot or tyrant? These are all the things you can explore, and none of that is set in stone until it's narrated in the game, which is fantastic, I think. Now, before I actually give a brief overview of how play goes, and I'm not going to tell you everything about how play goes because, one, as you can see, I'm not all the way through the book yet, so I haven't learned all of the various rules, but I will give you a rough idea of how a turn progresses, but not all the nitty-gritty. But before I do that, I need to go through terminology for you. There are 3 levels of history that you're going to be using, or you would be using in this game. The period, the event, and the scene. A period is a portion of time that is vast. It could be months, it could be decades, it could be centuries or millennia. It is something where there is an overarching theme. So for instance, one time period could be the golden age of the such and such empire. And if you're telling a fantasy story and you've established that there's an empire, or even if you haven't established that there's an empire, you could say one of the time periods is the golden age of the Silver Falcon Empire. I'm rubbish at coming up with things as an ad-lib, as anyone who's gamed with me knows, so let's go with that. A time period is the golden age of the Empire of the Silver Falcon being the name of the ruling household, or the ruling clan, or what have you. And that golden age has an unspecified amount of time. It could be a decade, or it could be hundreds of years. This golden age could go on for a long time, or it could come abruptly to a halt. You don't define time in this game, because people can always add to the story. A period, when you're describing it, when a player is describing a period, you're describing top down, what an outside observer sees. They do not see the detail. So if you're talking about, say, the golden age of the Silver Falcon, that might be a time when they have military superiority, they might have trade superiority with their neighbours, they could have masses of outpourings of culture. And that is what an outsider would see. They'll see these shiny, polished armies, they will see trading fleets, and they will see migrations of artists and scientists and philosophers to the learning centres of the Silver Falcon capital. They do not necessarily see what's happening inside the capital, or on board any given trade fleet, or inside the barracks of the armies, or anything like that. It's a sort of like an outside-in look at it. You are not inside when you're describing the period, you are outside looking in, and you're giving a broad brushstroke. When you're describing a period, you give a broad brushstroke for a vast portion of time, and you then dictate if it's light or dark, what the overall tone of the time period is. If it's light, then it's a positive time. If it's dark, then it's a time of despair. Then you go to the next level down, which is the event. Events happen in time periods. So say we're looking at the time period, the golden age of the Empire of the Silver Falcon. One of those events could be the coronation of Emperor Justin the Glorious. We've not mentioned him before, but suddenly there is now part of our game. There is the coronation for an emperor called Justin the Glorious, and that is an event in the time period. And again, when you're doing an event, you're looking from the outside in. You see what an outsider, an observer would see. So someone who is perhaps watching the coronation, but is not privy to the person putting the crown on his head. He's not in the know with the people who are putting the crown on the head. They're not in the know with the advisors behind the throne or anything like that. You are someone watching the coronation from the aisles. Much like the British did when Queen Elizabeth II was had her coronation back, oh goodness, that would be the 50s now. You're an outsider looking in. You don't get to know the details. And the person who chooses the event narrates what people see in the event. The next level down is the scene. And the scene is on the ground level. The scene is not narrated by the active player. It is a unit of time where everyone actually gets to roleplay a part, and some people will roleplay a main part and some minor parts. And the idea is you want to answer a question about something happening in an event. So let's take Emperor Justin the Glorious, his coronation. We want to ask ourselves a question. Do his nobles, do his court actually want him to be the emperor? And you might then do a scene in the sort of like the wings of the cathedral where he's receiving coronation, with maybe if you've decided that if the coronation happens at the hands of an archbishop and there are a couple of grand dukes and a general of the army, maybe you're having a scene with those 4 characters discussing. Each player takes a character in that scene, and then each player then shares what their character's thinking, and then they role play it out until someone feels that the question's been answered. Do the nobility want Emperor Justin the Glorious on the throne? And that then answers that question. So the scene level is very, very on the ground. You are inside, and you're defining the nuts and bolts of history at this point. Everyone else is just seeing this new emperor on the throne in the golden age of the Silver Falcon, the Emperor of the Silver Falcon. But actually, by asking the question, are the nobles happy? You're introducing the idea that you have nobility, that you have intrigue. They're not happy. They might not be happy with it, or they might be happy with it. You're introducing things that other people can riff with in their turns. And that's how this game works. When everyone takes a turn, they add a new period or an event or a scene. If they take a turn to add a period, they just say, blah, this is the time period of this happens, and this is the general principle of this era. So after the golden age of the Empire of the Silver Falcon, you could actually have the rise of the Striking Tiger dynasty. I'm just going to use animal things. The next time period that you define is the rise of the Striking Tiger. Now that might not be immediately after the Silver Falcon, because you don't define that it's immediately after, you just define that it's after. So the Silver Falcon has fallen at some point and a new dynasty has actually arisen. A player can then describe the new dynasty. The player can describe an event, so the coronation of an emperor, a victorious battle, a scandal, a royal marriage, anything like that. You can describe all of these things, and then you can get into the nuts and bolts with your scenes and decide what the actual overall thing is. And you're deciding light and dark each time. If the event looks light, if the period is light, but maybe the scene's dark, maybe the nobility didn't want Emperor Justin, maybe basically they don't want him, but none of them can get the person they want, so he's the person they dislike the least. Something like that. So that is what the 3 time periods that you work with in the game: periods, events, and scenes. Okay, so that's events, scenes, and periods. The way the game is played, you get your players around the table. You need sort of like index cards and pens for this. You don't need dice, or at least as far as I can tell, you don't need dice. I've read about half the book and dice are not mentioned, and I don't think you will need them, to be honest. Although I can see how this game would link in with other roleplay systems like GURPS or World of Darkness or Dungeons and Dragons, or depending on what kind of story you're telling. Anyway, you decide on your story. The players then basically agree what kind of story they want to tell. Now, for me personally, I would want to tell possibly a fantasy epic or a science fiction epic, or possibly a supernatural one based on World of Darkness. Those are the 3 games that really would appeal to me. Anything would be fun, but those are the ones I really want to do at some point, and hopefully I'll be able to do that and do a little bit of videoing of them so that you can actually see them in play. But the players agree what sort of game they're wanting to play, and they get a top level statement that defines the genre and the trajectory of the story. So that might be an empire rises out of the bones of a fallen civilization. That is the top end statement. So there's an implication that something has happened before, and there is the directive that an empire is going to grow. Now, this empire might not appear early on, and if we use the previous periods that I've mentioned, the Silver Falcon and the Striking Tiger, neither one of them might be the empire, and given that Silver Falcon fell as a result of the Striking Tiger rising, the implication is Silver Falcon definitely wasn't the empire, but maybe the empire is the remnants of these dynasties all coming together. But whatever, it doesn't matter. You've got your top end, and that defines the trajectory of the play. You then take 2 time periods to act as bookends. That's the technical term used in the rules. The first bookend is the period that defines the start of your timeline. So it could be from the ashes of a fallen civilization, tribes of humanity come together to form a new kingdom. That's your first time period, and you then actually say, you then would define whether it's, when you're playing the game, you would actually give a lot of verbal detail, but then you'd sort of like summarize it on the little the cards and put it in a timeline. So you've got chronological left to right, and then when you're adding in events and scenes, you do top to bottom. So anytime you add an event into a time period, you would put the event underneath the time period, and you would put the scene underneath the event. And at any point you can add new time periods or new events, and so long as you do not break established continuity, you can put your events and time periods anywhere. And that's cool. So you set up the out of the ashes of a fallen civilization, a new kingdom emerges. That's your bookend for the start of history. The end of your time period might be, how would we end our history? Possibly with a fall, or a time period where actually a new evolution of life form finds the ruins of the human civilization, perhaps. Or perhaps the end of this recorded empire is when humanity travels to the stars. Because there's nothing to say that a fantasy story can't go all the way up to modern age. So perhaps from the bones of a fallen civilization, a new kingdom is formed, is the starting bookend, and perhaps the finishing bookend is in an age of enlightenment, humanity takes their first steps into interstellar travel. Something like that. And that's the final time period in this defined game. So the implication is, yes, there's going to be an interstellar story, but it's not in our scope. So we've got the 2 bookends, we've got the sort of like the trajectory. We then have a palette, which is basically a yes-no column. And you take all your players and you sit around a table and you go around the table once. Everyone is allowed to add one idea to the yes column or the no column, and then everyone discusses it. If everyone agrees with something in the yes column, that is definitely allowed in the story. It doesn't necessarily mean it will definitely appear in this story, but it's allowed. If something is agreed that it's definitely in, if after discussion something remains in the no column, it is definitely not allowed. So you might have your fantasy epic and you might say, I don't want zombies at all. Yes, magic's going to happen, yes, necromancy's probably going to happen, but zombies bore me, I don't want zombies. I think they sound stupid, I think they are stupid, I don't want zombies. And if everyone agrees, then zombies can never appear in the story because you've established it as a rule of the world. You might say, I don't want guns in this world. I want all technology to be magic based. I don't want an industrial revolution. I want all advanced technology to be magic based. That could be a rule of the world. So that actually has quite a big impact later on. But yes, whatever your decisions are, you go around the table, and if everyone adds something to one of the columns, you go around a second time. And at the end of the second time, then you're ready to start play. If not everybody adds something, because you don't have to add anything to the palette, if even one person has missed out on the first round of the table, then that's it. That's the end of the palette. Everything else is fair game, and you start the game. The way gameplay works is you have a player 1 takes a turn, and then it goes round the table left each player gets a turn. Player 1, each turn is called the lens. At the end of a turn, the lens moves round the table. The lens defines the focus for a turn, so they might say, the advice is to focus in to a very close focus on your story. So you might focus on a particular king or a particular time period that's quite short. So you might say, I want to focus on the reign of Emperor Justin the Glorious, for instance. Taking what I've already said in this video, let's say the lens says, I would like to focus this turn on Emperor Justin, or King Justin the Glorious. Emperor Justin the Glorious, we called him earlier. So that's what this turn's about. If this is turn 1, there has been no mention of Emperor Justin the Glorious. But that's fine, because until something is said in the game, everything's up for grabs. So the lens then takes their turn. When it is any player's turn, they are allowed to add a period to the timeline, or if they can add an event to an existing period, or they can add a scene to an event. However, the lens player can add a period and then an event in that period, or they can add an event to an existing period and a scene in that event. And once everyone's had a shot, I think the lens gets an extra shot because they defined the focus for that turn. So player 1, the lens, gets a lot of creative control in their turn. But they bounce off the other players, which will take things in unexpected ways. And it will make a wholly unique story. That's terrible English. That will make a unique story based on who you have at the table, because different people will have different ideas. So say for instance, we've got our 2 bookends. We've got our Ashes of Civilization, a new kingdom is formed and humanity goes to the stars after an age of enlightenment, and the lens says, I want to focus on Emperor Justin the Glorious, and they say, for my turn I'm going to create the time period, the golden age of the Empire of the Silver Falcon, and I want to put in there the event, the coronation of Emperor Justin the Glorious. They don't have to put in the event, but because they're the lens, they are the lens that turn, they get to put in 2. And then play passes to the next player to the left, so the player can either add a scene to the coronation, they can add another time period so long as it relates to Emperor Justin, although they might struggle with that, or they can add another event in the time period, or in a time period so long as it is about Emperor Justin. So they could put an event, the birth of Justin blah blah blah, soon to be Emperor. And in each of these events you would give a few lines or a paragraph or 2 about what the period or the event is, and you would dictate whether it's light or dark, so people know what the overall mood is. And everyone takes a turn adding in time periods or events or scenes until you get all the way around the table, and the lens takes a final turn, and then once they've finished their final turn, once everyone's had a shot, and you might have had to roleplay a few scenes along the way, because people might think, actually, I'm quite interested in learning more about this coronation. I want to learn more about what people think about them. Or some people might say, actually, maybe he's called Emperor Justin the Glorious in hindsight because of some of the things he do. So maybe we put in some events about his reforms, or his military victories, or his diplomatic victories. All of these things are fair game, and that is the entire basis of a turn. On the next turn, the lens passes to the next player on the left, and they might say, I want to focus this turn on something else entirely. And they might come up with an entirely new time period and events in it, and the players on that turn will focus on that. However, they might, so long as they stick with the focus, say they want to talk about the Striking Tiger dynasty, they might actually they might add a time period for the rise of the Striking Tiger, and you could put an event within that period where they actually find ruins of the Silver Falcon. Ruins of the Silver Falcon. So actually you're then defining that there's quite a large time period in between the two, and then you might start, you can then at that point show how the previous time period is influencing the next time period. So I'm being very prescriptive because I came up with an idea when I was making this video for this fantasy. I'm not going to write it down because I don't have any ideas other than the names I've just came out with, Justin the Glorious and the Striking Tiger and the Silver Falcon, but I decided to riff with that. You could do literally any kind of story you want with this game, and that was really exciting to me. I think this is a fantastic opportunity for creative gaming groups. It's a game that doesn't really require a games master. It doesn't require an awful lot of preparation. You've got your top end definition, you've got your two bookends and your palette, and you need some note cards to note what your timeline is. Maybe you need a board to stick your note cards on, or maybe you use a piece of software to do that. That might work as well. I think this is also a fantastic tool for creative writers because it gives you an idea of how you might actually build a timeline for your story. If you're trying to do a story, stories are built up on events, and events are built up around scenes. So I think it's definitely worth looking at this and exploring this gameplay, because one of the things that you need to do as a writer is you need to keep the creative muscles flowing all the time. Part of that's reading, part of that's writing, and part of that's doing other things that are related to this. And Microscope by Ben Robbins is one of those things. I am really excited to actually start playing this with my group. I think it's going to be fantastic. I beg your pardon, I really want to do a fantasy epic. I think that would be fantastic. I really fancy doing a science fiction one as well. And I was talking to one of my friends who plays the Games Workshop games Warhammer 40,000, Warhammer 30,000. I said you could actually do this as you could basically do an alternative version to the Imperium of Man and their vast military expansion through the galaxy, which is the Warhammer 30,000 sort of like timeline, just before chaos shows up and everything goes to, well, everything goes bad, and the humans are not even the good guys. Although in Warhammer 40,000 the humans weren't the good guys anyway. There's not really any good guys out there. There's only folks that are fighting for the greater good, and everyone else is just a little bit selfish. Anyway, this has been John from itsmorethanjustgaming.com, and this has been my thoughts on the game Microscope. I love this game. I'm hoping that my enthusiasm and my description has conveyed why it's awesome. I hope it also actually helps creative writers out there. I think actually that's a good idea. I should probably get this game, and I should probably play it with some of my friends so that I can get thinking in the right terms for making timelines. If you have enjoyed this video and found it interesting, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and if you want to chat to me in the comments, please feel free. There will be an accompanying article on my website, itsmorethanjustgaming.com, although it won't have an awful lot to say other than hosting this blog. But if you want to actually come across to my website and say hello, there will be a link to that in the description. Otherwise, bye for now, and thanks for watching.